Nathaniel Cross sat on the floor of the white room. The floor was a seamless expanse of synthetic polymer, colder than a dormant engine but twice as smooth. There were no corners in this space. No shadows to rest the eyes. No sounds to anchor the soul. Just a vast, terrifying nothingness that had driven generals and poets to claw at their own skin within minutes. The air was sterile. It tasted of nothing but recycled oxygen and filtered static, the kind of silence that felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. He could feel the weight of his old mining coat, heavy and stiff against his shoulders. It was a relic of a harder life, its fabric worn thin at the elbows and stained with the dust of a dozen different moons. In the deep, frayed creases of the collar, there was the faint, stubborn ghost of burnt chicory coffee. It was a smell from a kitchen 30 light-years away. It was the scent of a Tuesday morning before the shift started. He leaned his head back, closing his good eye, and let that smell pull him away from the blinding white walls. Against his palm, the brass casing of his pocket watch felt like a warm stone. He didn't open it. He didn't need to see the hands moving. He just felt the mechanical heart beating against his skin. Would you have found peace in a cage made of clouds? Or would you have searched for a door that didn't exist? Because Nathaniel wasn't looking for a way out. Beneath the white polymer floor, the station hummed. High above the white room, Prelate Varis watched the monitors with all 12 of his primary eyes. The oculari were masters of the visual spectrum, and to them, the white room was the ultimate weapon of the high tribunal. It wasn't just a room, it was a sensory eraser. To an oculari, 3 minutes in this void resulted in permanent neurological fragmentation. The brain, starved of input, would begin to eat itself, hallucinating terrors to fill the silence. Varis adjusted his silken robes, his secondary gill slits flaring in a slow, rhythmic pulse of anticipation. The human had been inside for 40 minutes. Most species began screaming at 10. Some began weeping at 5. But Nathaniel Cross hadn't moved. He sat like a mountain carved from ancient basalt, his breathing so steady it didn't even register a spike on the biometric sensors. Varis's glowing pupils contracted to pinpricks of icy, translucent blue. He leaned closer to the transparent plasteel of the observation deck, his skin shifting from a vibrant, triumphant orange to a dull, confused ochre. This was a statistical impossibility. The silence in the room was absolute. Nathaniel didn't fight it. He welcomed it. In the belt, silence wasn't a threat, it was a confirmation. It was the sound of a universe minding its own business while you worked the seams. He let his mind wander back to the jagged edges of Vesta 4. He remembered the way the sunlight hit the silicate veins in the rock, turning them into rivers of liquid gold for 3 seconds every rotation. He remembered the vibration of the drill in his boots, a deep, bone-shaking rhythm that felt more like music than work. His left thumb traced a jagged scar on his palm. It was a rough, raised line of tissue, a map of a moment when a cooling pipe had burst and the world had tried to freeze him solid. He had survived that month in a dead holler, drifting through the pitch black with nothing but the sound of his own heart. Compared to that, this room was a luxury suite. Which meant the silence wasn't an empty room. It was an old friend. He is catatonic, the high adjudicator whispered, her voice a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks that echoed in the observation deck. His mind has surely folded under the pressure of the null. We should begin the extraction and prepare the confession. Varis didn't answer immediately. He reached out with the judicial mental link, a delicate thread of psychic energy intended to brush against the human's surface thoughts. Usually, at this stage of isolation, a mind felt like a frayed wire, sparking with panic and desperate, fragmented memories. It was easy to harvest the truth when the ego was shattered. Instead, Varis felt a wall. Not a wall of stone or steel, but a wall of absolute, terrifying stillness. It was a depth of psyche he had never encountered in 30 years of service. His 12 eyes widened, the light in them flickering like a dying star. His skin began to lose its color entirely, turning a sickly, translucent gray. The human nervous system is a paradox, Varys managed to say, his voice strained and barely audible over the humming of the consoles. Most sentient life requires external stimuli to maintain the integrity of the self. Without it, the ego dissolves into chaos. But this one, he is generating his own reality from within, the same way a star creates its own heat in the cold of the void. Nothing. Nathaniel finally opened his good eye. He looked at the white ceiling, but he didn't see the synthetic panels. He saw the swirling nebulae of the Perseus arm. He felt the watch in his hand, its ticking a steady anchor in the white sea. He knew they were watching. He could feel the faint, oily itch of the mental link trying to find a purchase on his thoughts. He simply tightened his grip on the watch and pulled the silence tighter around him, like a blanket on a cold night. He waited. The digital clock on the observation console didn't tick, but its numbers bled into the darkness like glowing wounds. 1 hour and 14 minutes. Prelate Varys felt his primary heart stuttering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that clashed with the terrifying silence emanating from the room below. He had intensified the mental link to its legal limit, attempting to find a single crack in the human psychic armor, a solitary spark of fear or even the frantic static of boredom. Instead, he found only the vast, echoing chambers of a mind that had been built to withstand the weight of infinity. It was the same bone-deep stillness Nathaniel had mastered during the long, lonely rotations around the silent giants of the Outer Rim, where the only thing keeping a man from drifting into madness was the rhythmic clicking of his own tools and the memory of a warm hearth millions of miles away. Nathaniel felt a sharp, familiar irritation. A tiny grain of lunar regolith, sharp as a diamond and twice as stubborn, was wedged deep under the nail of his middle finger. It had been there for 3 days, a microscopic reminder of a faulty seal on a sifting tray. He focused on it, the physical discomfort providing a sharp, gritty contrast to the artificial perfection of the white room. He pushed his nail against his palm, leaning into the tiny sting. Because it wasn't torture. To Nathaniel, this was merely a Sunday afternoon without the radio. He remembered the long months in the silence of the belt, where the ship's oxygen scrubbers provided the only soundtrack to his life. He had learned then that a man's mind is not a vessel to be filled by the world, but a furnace that generates its own light. He stoked that furnace now, feeding it memories of the smell of rain on dry asphalt and the way his grandson, Ben, laughed when the old pocket watch finally chimed the hour. "Something is wrong," the high adjudicator hissed, her orange skin mottling with a pale, sickly green. "The link is, it is beginning to feed back. I am seeing things that do not exist. I see gray rocks. I see a small, primitive ticking machine." Varys let out a choked sound, his secondary eyes rolling back as the human's internal world began to overflow through the link. It wasn't a scream or a plea. It was a tidal wave of calm, a profound and heavy peace that felt like being buried in warm sand. It was too much for a species that lived for the visual, for the external, for the constant flicker of data. To the oculari, this level of internal focus was a form of neurological radiation. The silence broke first. With a heavy, mechanical groan that sounded like a dying beast, the reinforced door of the white room slid upward. The light from the corridor spilled into the chamber, a harsh, yellow intrusion that bit at the edges of the absolute white. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He didn't even squint. He simply stood up, his joints popping with the dry sound of old timber, and smoothed the front of his mining coat. Varys stumbled out of the observation lift, his legs trembling so violently he had to lean against the cold wall for support. Behind him, the high tribunal members stood frozen, their glowing eyes dim and flickering as if their internal batteries had been drained by the mere proximity to the human stillness. They had intended to break a man. They had accidentally looked into the eye of a storm that had no center. Nathaniel stepped out of the room, his heavy boots thudding against the metal floor of the hallway. He looked at Varys, his one good eye clear and unervingly sharp. He didn't look like a man who had just spent over an hour in a psychological vacuum. He looked like a man who had just finished a particularly satisfying meal. "The charges," Varys whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. They are withdrawn. The tribunal finds no evidence of anything. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass watch. He didn't look at the time. He just felt the weight of it, the steady, physical presence of the object. He looked at the circle of powerful, ancient aliens who had tried to erase his mind with nothingness, and a slow, lopsided grin spread across his weathered face. It was the smile of a man who knew a secret the universe had been trying to keep for eons. "You call this isolation?" Nathaniel asked, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. "I call it a nap." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked down the long, sterile corridor, the sound of his footsteps a rhythmic defiance against the silence of the station. He passed through the final security gate, emerging into the bustling, noisy atmosphere of the public docks. The air here was thick with the scent of ozone, fried protein, and the chaotic chatter of 1,000 different species. It was beautiful. Waiting by the fountain, sitting on a bench made of recycled starship hull, was a small boy with messy hair and a worn backpack. Ben looked up, his eyes widening with relief as he saw the familiar, bulky silhouette of his grandfather approaching. He didn't ask about the trial. He didn't ask about the room. He just reached out, his small hand finding the rough, calloused palm of the man who had raised him. Nathaniel stopped. He felt the warmth of the boy's hand, the most important sensory input in the galaxy. Carefully, he placed the brass pocket watch into Ben's palm. The boy's fingers closed around it, the ticking of the internal gears vibrating against his skin. The grandfather looked out through the massive viewports at the swirling, endless black of the deep void. He didn't fear it. He didn't hate it. He simply acknowledged it as a peer. The small brass heart of the watch beat steady and true against the boy's pulse.